Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for attending this meeting of CompTIA's Association of IT Professionals. My name is Steve Flowers and I serve as Vice President of the North Central Florida chapter of AITP. CompTIA is the leading global not-for-profit association for technology professionals, students, educators, and technology leaders. You may know CompTIA as the premier organization that pioneered a revolutionary IT certification, A+. This certification was not tied to a particular manufacturer, but was vendor neutral. The concept took off, and today CompTIA offers 4 IT certification series that test different knowledge standards from entry-level to expert. With more than 2,000 members, 3,000 academic and training partners, and tens of thousands of registered users spanning the entire information, communications, and technology industry, CompTIA has become a leading voice for the technology ecosystem. We focus our initiatives that support the success of businesses across the full IT channel, from the largest vendors on one end to smaller businesses providing IT hardware, software, and services on the other, as well as the ICT professionals that make our industry run. Simply stated, the industry's innovation and growth depends on you and hundreds of thousands of others just like you. We're here to help. Besides fostering and enabling IT certification, our mission is to be a voice and an advocate for the technology industry and to attract and enrich professionals through industry insight, networking, and education. Our vision is to be the go-to resource for individuals who seek to start, grow, restart, and advance their careers. We seek to fill the pipeline with the next generation of talent by supporting the largest, most diverse, innovative, and skilled workforce. As advocates for the technology industry, we also aspire to drive economic growth and benefit society. Our goal is to narrow the technology skills and confidence gap by encouraging people to enter the industry and by providing career-boosting tools and resources for the savvy IT pro. AITP traces its roots to 1951 and was formerly called the Data Processing Management Association, or DPMA. In 1971, the North Central Florida chapter of AITP was founded and is based in Gainesville, Florida. In 2016, CompTIA, seeing the need for a way to bring together IT pros, students, educators, and industry leaders, acquired AITP. We are leveraging the well-established leadership, organization, and infrastructure that is based on personal interaction at the local chapter level in more than 20 states around the country. Local chapters like this one are dedicated to the core values of ethics and professionalism in IT. We give back to our community by hosting presentations related to technology and business management. We also host socials and organize and promote networking events. We provide hands-on training, conduct tours of area tech facilities, and foster education. We encourage you to consider joining AITP if you desire to build your professional network, strengthen your technical knowledge and soft skills, develop a personal career path, and keep current on technology and business trends. Become a part of a large, growing, diverse, and talented group of CompTIA AITP members. We thank you again for investing your time and resources to join with us today. We hope you enjoy the experience. And now, let's introduce our special guest and begin the presentation. Welcome to this meeting of the North Central Florida chapter of CompTIA's Association of Information Technology Professionals. We thank you for attending either live in our studio today or online with Facebook, streaming live as we speak. We normally provide a couple of suggestions for housekeeping. If you will silence your cell phones, we would appreciate that. Restrooms are located outside this particular studio over there. Besides the people attending this evening in person, this event is, as I say, being streamed live on the North Central Florida website for Facebook and will be posted on our website later. There are a couple of special guests tonight here with us. Sean Sanford, who is from Chicago and is manager of member relations for CompTIA, AITP, and also Tom Zimnowski, who has flown in from Miami, who is vice president of member relations for CompTIA. We have some members of our organization in the audience tonight: Michael Lucas, immediate past president and webmaster for the chapter. We also have David Williams, our treasurer, and Tony Barr, who is a long-term member of our chapter as well. Before we get too far into this, I want to go ahead and thank very much Mr. Don Pizzette, who is the co-founder of ITProTV. He is also a member of AITP, but he and his organization have provided a tremendous number of resources and support for the chapter for the past several months. And we are very indebted to him and grateful for the support that he's provided. Don is going to do us the favor of introducing our special speaker tonight, Mr. Adam Gordon.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Don Pizzette, co-founder of ITProTV, and I get the honor to jump up here in front of AITP. And before I introduce Adam, let me just say a big thank you to the local chapter, and thank you guys for allowing us to have you here. It is a real honor and pleasure, and we're just excited to see everybody here and excited to jump into what is going to be a great topic. GDPR is going live soon, so a lot of people want to know more about it. And I can think of a few people who could present better on that than Mr. Adam Gordon, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for almost 20 years now, it seems. Adam, who many of you probably know from speaking engagements that he's done at previous security conferences. He has been involved for a long time with the New Horizons location down in Miami, Florida, and has been a instructor, teacher, mentor, just all around great professional to a lot of people. So, you know, I think we probably want to hear from him more than hear from me. So let me turn it over to Adam. And Adam, thank you for presenting on GDPR.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to spend time with all of you. And I look forward to answering your questions when we're done with the presentation. So I thought we would get started tonight by just spending a couple of minutes really doing two things. One, setting the stage, right? We're here to talk about GDPR, what it means potentially to IT professionals. Why is it important? What do we have to do in order to understand it better? So I thought we'd spend just a couple of minutes setting the stage to do that. And then I wanted to drill into some of the specifics around GDPR that may or may not be of interest to you, but you do need to be aware of. What are the definitional vocabulary terms and criteria that as IT professionals we need to be aware of with GDPR? It does officially go live this Friday on May 25th. It's been over or close to 2 years in the making in terms of the ramp for the legislation to actually go live, but it's been close to 20 years in the making. I want to talk about the history of it for just a minute as we get started. And then I've got a couple of assessment questions I want to share with you towards the end of the presentation, show you the different ways we look at risk and what you may want to think about in your organizations as you look ahead potentially to what GDPR may mean. And when we're done with that, I know we set aside some time for Q&A, and I'll be looking forward to hearing all those great questions you have about what you're going to do differently starting Friday morning to avoid issues and concerns with regards to GDPR. So if you take a look at the screen, I have up, and you may or may not have seen this. I don't know if anybody's actually gone out and taken the opportunity to pull up the legislation. But this is the actual text of the GDPR. So the General Data Protection, the General Data Protection Regulation. And I want to talk about just one element that really at the beginning sets the stage for what we're here to discuss. So let me bring this up here so you can see it. I tried to make it really big so it'd be obvious. But aside from the fact that it went live legitimately and traditionally 2 years ago now, when it was actually promulgated and formally passed April 27th of 2016, not into effect, but became something that had to be on the radar of all IT professionals. Remember that as we have our discussion tonight. It's been 2 years that this legislation has been sitting out there, really kind of baking and waiting for people to pay attention to it. But yet only maybe in the last 6 to 8 months have most people here outside of Europe really started to pay attention in the US. Some of you may have been paying attention much longer than that, but it's interesting. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of timelines in a minute. But the other thing I wanted to point out to you is the following, which is this statement right here. The fact that we are repealing prior specific conversations and indeed directives. And we'll talk about the difference between directive and regulation here in a minute. But the directive that is preceding the GDPR has been in force for a very long time, 9546 EC, which formed the foundation for privacy rights and, by extension, you could say risk management around data privacy in the EU and less traditionally throughout the world in many cases, at least in many places in the world, for the better part of the last 20 years. And yet most people don't realize that that is no longer in effect as of Friday, May 25th, when the GDPR goes into effect fully. And so it's interesting because we're swapping one set of regulatory oversight specifications for another. And yet at the same time, when I talk to many IT professionals, first thing I ask is, so what are you going to do differently? What have you been doing under this regime for the last 10 or 15 years? Oh, we've been doing this or that. We're aligned with ISO 27000 related standards. We do our risk assessment. We may be looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework, which has recently been announced and gone live, if you pay attention to those things. We do risk management framework, another NIST risk assessment framework, and or all sorts of other things, COBIT for governance, and many, many other frameworks that are out there. Great, I say. That's all really good. You audit, you have governance, you have risk, you have compliance. We check off all those things. You're focused on confidentiality, integrity, and probably availability. So those are all good. Are you going to translate all that? And how do you translate all that? Oh, well, we hadn't really thought about that. We didn't realize we had to translate what we do into a new solution. We thought we'd just keep doing the same things we're doing and simply potentially refer to a new framework. And that's not the approach, and unfortunately not the right answer. And this is where most people, unfortunately until now, have found themselves. We're going to try to change that over the next 20 to 30 minutes. Very lofty goal in 20 to 30 minutes, I grant you. But we're going to try to swap out that knowledge and at least prepare you to have that conversation. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at the full body of what's going into effect on May 25th, I would encourage you to take a look. If you need it, I'll be happy to provide the PDF for you. It's freely available and downloadable. This is actually right out of, as you can see, the official journal of the European Union in terms of where this was published 2 years ago and how to get a hold of it. But it is important to have a sense of that. And to that end, let me ask you two quick questions. I believe in interactive presentations because I could speak, as Don and many others who know me can tell you, for hours on end without taking a break. I'm not going to subject you to that, by the way. But I am a teacher and a trainer, and I have been for over 30 years. So I can easily stand up here and talk for 20 to 30 minutes with no trouble. But I'd like to engage you on 2 points. So number one, have any of you actually taken a look at the legislation and kind of gone through it? Okay, yeah, great. Okay, so it's going to be a very quick, interactive, one-person dynamic then. For the rest of you, just 2 pieces of information, maybe of interest to you as we get started. So when you look at this end to end, you will see in the very beginning, there are all these numbered statements, some very long, paragraphs in fact. And they go on and on and on for pages and pages and pages, all the preambulatory language. You know how many of those there are? You read it, you probably don't know. Nobody does unless you take a look. 173 preambulatory statements to get you ready, actually get you ready to say, okay, now that we've told you everything we want to exclude, include, think about, define, and or discuss, let's now talk about what we're going to do. 173, 45 pages approximately. Then we get down to the meat of the actual interactions that we have to engage in. You've read it. There are articles. That's what they are called. Those are the actionable items. There are...
I didn't claim that I understood it.
Okay, just asking if you know how many there are, that's all. There are 99 articles, 99 factual items that have to be taken into account and that potentially are actionable. Of those, 98 are important. And let me be clear, all 99 are important. The 99th is the one that puts this into effect as of May 25th, which means as of May 25th, we can put that one off to the side and say, okay, we check that box off, we're good. And there are 98 others we have to pay attention to from that point forward. 98 items and 173 preambulatory statements. By anybody's counting, right? That's a lot of knowledge. It's a lot of stuff, right? If I have to remember more than 5 things in a row and keep them in my mind for any length of time, I got to write them down. And I'm a teacher. It's what I do for a living. I tell people things and I remember them. I have children. I'm good at this, right? And I still have to make notes. So what about business leaders? What about IT professionals? What about risk managers? What about all the people that have to keep track of those 173 statements and 98 to-do items going forward? And by the way, if you happen to miss one, is there a penalty involved? Oh yeah, we'll talk about penalties. There are some significant penalties. Potentially 4% of your gross revenue as a company globally. Every year, ad infinitum until you become compliant. That can be a lot of money. Imagine, we were talking a little bit before we got started, a few of us, you're a small to medium-sized company. You may not have a very large customer base that's going to be compliant, or you have to be compliant around with this particular solution. And you may not think about it. Right? Don and I were talking about the fact that a lot of companies here in the United States are saying, well, this may not apply to us. We're not even really paying attention. It's not on our radar. Wrong approach, by the way, right? It's coming whether you want it or not. You deal with one EU citizen one time, and you have to be compliant for all data, all times, because you now hold data in your system that potentially could be exposed by a breach. And until you purge that data and no longer maintain it, you have a liability. And if you do anything with accounting, you know anything about information management, you deal with risk, liabilities are what cost you money, and the way you control them and mitigate them is through oversight, risk mitigation factors of some kind, and you do more and more and more of that. But that also costs you more and more and more money. So it can be a very tedious exercise if we're not paying attention and we're not careful. So just keep that in mind as we get started. Let me just bring my slide deck up. I wanted to be outside the presentation to do that with you before we got started. I said I would talk briefly about the difference between regulations and directives, and I think it's a very telling and important distinction. We're coming from a directive. 9546 is a directive that is being replaced May 25th by a regulation. And I noted the key differences on the presentation for you. A directive was open to interpretation by member state within the EU. Right? Meaning, you went to Germany, you went to France, you went to, up until recently, you went to the UK, and you would have potentially different takes on what privacy and data privacy and regulatory compliance may be. Because every country had the right, indeed the obligation, to interpret those, and as a result, implement that, whatever that meant, according to whatever norms, standards, and or issues and concerns may apply to them. And that may change over time, by the way, meaning over the 10 to 20-year period that the directive has been in force. Smaller period of time for newer members in the EU, because the membership has grown over time. We may or may not see standardization. In fact, we pretty much guarantee that we don't see standardization in all areas. And as a result of that, member states have taken it on themselves to interpret what that meant. One of the key changes with the GDPR is that it's now a regulation. Regulation, as you can see, is applicable to every member state in the union in a uniform manner. Everybody implements the same way. We play off, in other words, the same playbook, if you will. As a result of that, no negotiations, no exemptions, no exceptions for member states that have concerns. Now, that may seem draconian, and that's not what we're here to discuss, right or wrong, whether you like that or not. We're not here to debate the efficacy of whether or not a regulation versus a directive is the right approach. That's already happened, and the group that's in charge of that figured out regulation is the way to go. But it is important for us as a level set to understand that now, in theory, EU regulatory compliance, GDPR compliance, is going to be spoken about with one voice and one objective. Here's 98 things you need to do based on the articles, and here's everything that needs to happen, as opposed to businesses having to negotiate their way through, potentially, a minefield of regulatory obligations by country, which can be very confusing to say the least, right? So that's probably the biggest thing that we want to be aware of. With regards to the GDPR overall, there are 4 or 5 key specific aims that it really addresses. And I've kind of touched on 2 or 3 of them already, but let me just summarize them here for you quickly. You could see giving citizens back. When we say citizens, we mean anybody that is a citizen of the EU, but giving them back control over their personal data. This is not a new and novel idea, but the problem, unfortunately, is it's a very difficult one to be able to define and to put into some sort of compliance-based regime that we can measure, we can manage, and ultimately we can attend to. And so citizens are being enabled and really being empowered to have control over their personal data. Now, let's talk about personal data for a minute, right? You heard a little bit about me in the introduction. You heard a lot about AITP and some of the people associated with AITP that may or may not be attending this presentation. And you learned our names and perhaps our titles, or a little bit about me in terms of me being an educator, working for New Horizons, and working for ITProTV. Is that classified as personal data? What do you think? Would you say it is? It could be. I mean, you could make the argument that it could be, but you could also easily make the argument that it may not be. Maybe open to interpretation is my point, right? And so what we need is definitive understanding. We need guidelines and we need specificity to be able to give citizens back, or anybody back, control. It's easy to say, I want you to be in charge of this. It's hard to build a regime that allows you to do that effectively, is my point. And the GDPR has really been structured to try to do that. We're going to talk about how that happens the next few minutes. Simplify the regulatory environment for business. That may or may not be true. We'll see how that goes. I think it's going to be more complex for a lot of reasons. This is one of them. But I think just in general, the political, social, and economic environments we live in today, internationally and globally, are making it more complex, not less complex, to manage information and manage it securely. I don't think the GDPR by itself is going to be able to tip that balance. I think technology and the availability of information ubiquitously is moving us in a very different direction. And I wanted you to note the creation versus go live date as we started our presentation, right? 2016 versus 2018. It's going to be important in one area that we talk about because unfortunately, and this is my personal opinion, big disclaimer, but unfortunately, I think technology has moved us past, in some respects, the reference point for this regulation, even though it is ground shifting in terms of what it is able to do, start to finish, if you think of it that way. Create a modern and harmonized data protection framework across the EU. We've talked about that already. And reform is really seen as a key enabler, I put that in quotes, right, of the digital single market, a concept that is often talked about, kind of like cloud computing, hard to define, right, Internet of Things and Web 2.0 and all that other great marketing discussion that we have around technology. The idea would be a single market built around the EU and the ability to enable that through not only the management of information securely, but the application of technology across all platforms to do that. And of course, the EU agenda on security, both well defined by the EU, but I think often misunderstood by those around the EU. So what are some of the key changes? We have fines, I mentioned that already, 4% of global turnover or revenue, or up to 20 million euro, whichever potentially winds up being the greater of the two. You could be up to 20 million, but if you're below 20 million, it could be up to 4% of your gross revenue. So just keep that in mind, right? That can be a big check that people may wind up, unfortunately, writing. I wonder if you could pay for that on a credit card and get miles. That would be really cool if you could do that, right? Might be some value there, right? No, well, just, but somebody has a credit card somewhere that may do that. All right, so consent, more clearly defining, easier to withdraw, record keeping required. Consent is one of the key elements we talk about here, right? I, as an individual, putting myself in that thought process of somebody whose data is being managed, I now have a right to be forgotten. I can push a button, as we've probably all heard about in the last couple of years. Been a couple of court cases to this end. And I now have the enshrined right to be able to go to a technology entity or any business and say, I would like you to no longer manage my data. I would like it back, please, because you no longer meet my criteria, whatever they are, for doing so in a successful and secure way. I have to justify that. I can't just randomly go and say I would like to have that done, but assuming I follow the proper procedures and standards, it's a relatively straightforward process. That is very, very radically different than where we've been. It's radically different than where we can even do today here in the United States, if you think about the logic of that. We're struggling right now to deal with net neutrality and figure out whether or not we want to pass laws about governing access to the digital world, let alone how we govern information within it. So it's a very different mind space we're in here in the US versus other areas in the world. We have to think about the politics and the economics and the socio-political implications of what GDPR does for us, because it really puts a different context and framework around the conversation. We are liable for risk management under GDPR here in the US if we own and hold data as a company for EU nationals, or we do business with companies that do. But we come from a very different socio-political economic climate and landscape. And so it's going to be very challenging for us to figure out how to square those boxes and create connections that are meaningful in the face of GDPR. Transparency, we're significantly going to have more information when data is collected because it is now defined as to what we do need to provide, under what conditions, and to what end. But we also, as we said, have the ability to opt out depending on what we choose to do. We'll talk about automated decision-making as one focal area here because I think it's very telling and interesting given the technology landscape. Right to be forgotten, I mentioned, for people that want to have their personal data removed under certain circumstances, actually is something that we can ascribe to. Security, risk minimization approach, moving towards certification-based mechanisms. We will be able to be certified and aligned with GDPR. Many businesses have been trying to make a living on that the last couple of years. Yeah, it's a gray area, right? There's no standard out there right now that says, oh, you do this, and that equals compliance. That will be coming. We do have the playbook, don't get me wrong, but there are many, many approaches. Let me share with you what I mean by that. So let's say, for instance, I come to you, and as a business person, I say to you, hey, I'm a risk assessment manager. I'm GDPR as a consultant, I can do GDPR for you. May I show you how I would do an assessment for your company? You say, oh, that's great. I need to do that. I may be a lawyer and I'm trying to sell my services. I could be an IT professional trying to sell my services. And so I would do an assessment. And I'm going to share with you some assessment questions in just a few minutes that will help you to frame that conversation. But let's say I want to do that and then give you the output of that. It may look very much something like this. Without going into all the detail, I may give you some sort of spreadsheet that shows you people that are responsible, that shows you the nature of data that we are moving through, that shows you privacy statements and things we're telling customers about how we management of confidential data, in other words, across all these areas. And I may show you compliance-related data. And I may do this across a very large swath of your organization and hand you a spreadsheet full of information. At which point you will look at that and go, oh, that's great. That's just what we needed. And you'll file it away duly on a shelf somewhere, electronically or physically, and hopefully do something with it. But let's be honest. What happens more often than not, you may or may not get to it, best of intentions aside. And even if you get to it, could you make heads or tails out of what's in there easily? It's very, very confusing. It's hard to understand. It can be overwhelming, right? We're swimming upstream against a tide of information that's coming out of a fire hose in language that we don't necessarily understand or even know how to relate to. And yet we're being asked time and again to manage risk in the context and the crucible of that language and of that framework. Excuse me, I'm just going to get back to where I was just by way of talking. So understanding requirements is going to be very, very important to what we do. And you can see on the screen here that we have different requirements broken into categories. Consent, we've talked about. Breach notification, been all the rage and in all the news. Almost every week, it's hard to pick up some sort of electronic journal or newspaper or something without someone in the world reading about a breach notification. I was just reading today, earlier today actually, you may not have even seen this one before we got started, that if you're a customer of Comcast, which many of us may be, they apparently had a little oopsie and have a data breach on their hands. Customer data was leaked based on some issues in one of their systems. And I could go down a litany of corporate names that fill out that glorious list, right, of people that have had problems or companies that have problems in the last 12 months. And many, many of our technology companies and leaders around the world are on that list. So breach notification, important. Right to access, right to be forgotten. We see this language a lot. I have a right to do this. I have a right to do that. This is part of what we talk about in GDPR. Data portability. I have the right to be able to take my data and go somewhere else with it. Right to be forgotten equals data portability. I can take data and move it from place to place. And this is important because now we have to think about what forms data take. What format can data be portable in? Is there a universal standard for data? Data is this undefined thing, right? We're having a very interesting conversation before we got started about structures and how we learn and how we can shape and understand reality through the use of data. Well, you give me a data type and I can offer you 4 alternatives to offer data in the same kind of way, but in a different format. And so it's interesting because one of the things that the shapers of GDPR did was say, you know what? We have this right to be forgotten and this right to data portability. Guess what our new data standard is going to be? CSV, comma separated file format, right? As a result, if you can export data and make it portable, you have to do it in a CSV format, which is not unusual, by the way, because that's a pretty standard and ubiquitous file format today. But that is the enshrined standard. It's good to know because if we have data that's unstructured and not in that format, we have to think about how we're going to transcribe and transform that data. So there's going to be a huge, I'm sure you heard it here first, by the way, prediction. It's going to be a huge market in data transformation and data management in order to get unstructured data into formats that become portable. Because that's going to be a moneymaker initially as companies scramble to figure that out. Because that's buried somewhere in those 98 articles you got to pay attention to. But if you haven't read it, you may not know that. And we have to guarantee that, by the way. If I have a right to request my data, you, to be compliant, not only have to give it to me, but have to give it to me in a CSV format in a timely fashion, relatively speaking, right? All right, and usually, by the way, that compliance timeline is anywhere from 24 hours to maybe 72 hours, depending on what we're talking about. So a relatively short period of time, depending on what we're talking about. There are exceptions for large-scale data migrations. All right, privacy by design. This idea of designing and actually creating privacy. Can imagine somebody tinkering in their lab, right, trying to figure out privacy. And DPOs, data protection officers. A concept that's not unusual and not new, but just the marketing and branding around it is. We've had risk management officials. I see chief risk officers as a thing that's cropping up and has been on the rise, popular-wise, in the C-suite for a while. Not just chief risk officers, but many different types. We've had CIOs and CPOs, chief privacy officers. In some cases, CSOs, CISOs. The list goes on, right? We're full of acronyms and alphabet soup when we talk about privacy and risk management. But when you boil it down, we've had somebody in corporations, both in and out of the EU, on point, or a group of somebody's hopefully, on point to manage risk, compliance, concerns, all these kind of things, probably for 2 or 3 decades. We've had legal teams that manage and specialize in this globally. So this is not unusual, but to define it, brand it, call it out, make that specification in terms of that particular person the point of the spear with regards to management of data and risk mitigation around privacy is a new concept and a very important one. I just go through and kind of summarize the remarks I made in going over these on the following slide. So I'll briefly hit a couple of items that are highlightable and obviously leave it up to you to go dig into the legislation and look the regulations specifically. But I do call out articles that may be of interest to you around these individual topics, and you can refer back and see where they are in the document. Remember, 99 overall, 98 that are actionable as of May 25th, right? So Articles 7 through 9 deal with consent, the ability to be able to have clear and affirmative consent. So individuals have to opt in and say, yes, I'd like you to collect my data under these conditions, and I have to give you that capability. You may have seen the last 12, maybe 18 months or so, depending on where you live and what kind of web browsing and interaction with the web you have. You may have started to notice websites in the last year or so that have popped up new banners around privacy statements or changing terms of service. You hear it referred to different ways. Also, the cookies statements around how we manage cookies are a subset of this. If you've seen these things, that's a direct result of the consent requirement and the fact that we now have to put you on notice as an individual that we're managing information in a certain way. And this is not limited to US, UK, EU, or even any particular region of the world. This is a global phenomenon. I have companies that I work with, customers that are in every area, every corner of the world, and every one of them, without exception, has had to think about how they're going to deal with this because of the potential exposure. And so it's interesting that a political bloc that, given its history, nobody thought would survive its birth, to go back to the beginning of the EU and what it meant, that has really come into its own and is having trouble, right? It's in its adolescent years, having growing pains. People are leaving, people are trying to figure out what it's going to mean, but ultimately has radically shifted the way we look at risk and risk management from an information perspective globally. It's very interesting. I am a political scientist. Full disclosure, it's my official academic training before I started doing computers. Breach notification, right? Article 33. I said that most timelines are somewhere between 24 to 72 hours with regards to definitions. You could see there in the second bullet point. In the event of a data breach, and this is one of the most important ones, because almost without exception, every company in the world, up until and including today, that has had a data breach has run afoul of this particular statement, and in 3.5 days is going to start being fined if they don't get their act together, right? In the event of a data breach, data processors, the company, the entity that owns your data that's interacting with it, have to notify the controllers, the point of information management and regulatory compliance, and most importantly, customers of any risk within 72 hours. I have trouble getting a shopping list together to look ahead for 3 days to figure out what I want to buy in the week when I go to the market. Can you imagine a multi-billion-dollar global entity that has to manage risk and notify not just the regulatory compliance arm, but customers? This could be hundreds of millions. Imagine, let's wind back the clock. Let's take a look at Facebook and the little antics that happened right over the last year with Cambridge Analytica. Imagine that GDPR was in force when this occurred, when this came to light. You'd have to notify every customer of Facebook, 500,000 approximately, give or take, right? That they were subjected to potential exposure within 72 hours. That doesn't mean you have to knock on everybody's door and give them a personal letter, but it does mean you have to put up notification. It does mean you have to make a clear declarative statement in public that everybody can read, not wait for rumors and innuendo to circulate for 3 months before you come clean, which is what unfortunately is the modus operandi for most businesses today. This is going to radically change, radically alter the risk landscape, the exposure quotients around risk, and also the calculus around how we actually deal with things like bug bounty programs and how we deal with zero-day exploits. Because all of these things, if you think about it, are subtext under this, although they're not clearly defined. Right now, we see on average most companies that deal with zero-day exploits and have bug bounty programs out there are running anywhere from 1 month to maybe 2 to 3 months from beginning of cycle where they actually learn about the bug and then mitigate and then expose that bug and actually come clean about it in public. Somewhere between 30 to maybe 90 days. We're talking about going down to 3 days. It's a very, very different timeline. Very, very different. We're going to hold questions till the end if you don't mind, if that's okay. All right. And I'd like to hear what it is. So try to keep the context, and I will be happy to address it when we get to the end. Right to access, Articles 15 and 16, right? Data controllers should provide electronic copies of personal data for free to the data subject. This is also important. You have a right to have a copy of your data, and you have a right to it for free. Now, in the United States, for the last maybe 10 years or so, we've had the ability to get free copies of our credit report. If you take advantage of this at least once a year, if you're subject to a potential identity theft event, you can get copies more frequently, right, under certain circumstances. And that has, for the most part, worked out well for people that have to deal with that. There are some changes in the laws that go on from time to time, but in general, that's been the case. It's not quite the same thing. That's just your data with regards to your credit history, right? This is any kind of personal data held by a company. But your medical records. Think about all of the kind of data that may be out there. Could be your school transcripts. You went to college, perhaps high school, grade school, whatever it would be that may or may not be kept by a company. They may be subject to this. It could be your profile information or your social networking information from various companies, right? I don't know about all of you. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't have a problem admitting that in public. I am a recovering social media person. But we have to, as a result of what we do here at ITProTV, have a social media presence, which is nice. It's a great way for me to keep in touch with my students and keep in touch with customers. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I know people all over the world. And so I use LinkedIn to be able to do that. Imagine all the information that's out there about you on a site like LinkedIn. Forget about Facebook and some of these other areas, right, that you may engage in. So right to access can be very broad and can be complicated for companies to manage and interact with, if you think about the logic of it. Right to be forgotten. We've talked about this, right? When data is no longer relevant, data subjects have the ability to go and say, hey, I have changed my name. I'm no longer Adam Gordon. I got married, or I had a name change legally for whatever reason. And as a result, I'm now Adam Smith. I would like you to erase all records of me being Adam Gordon and validate that that has been done. And please do so in a timely fashion, right? Because it has to be done in a timely fashion. And also should not be able to be undone. Meaning, when you flip that switch and get rid of my persona as Adam Gordon, you can't say, oh, but we have a record of that, we're going to go back. No, you have a record of nothing and you don't go back, right? So this is also important. You actually cannot, quote unquote, live off the grid and become a ghost. You can take a big step closer to modifying your persona, if you understand the logic of this. We've talked about data portability. I talked about CSV as being that go-to format, as I mentioned. And you should be able to move data between not only companies, but between competitors. This is going to change the landscape, right? Think about this. I want to take my personal data, my buying profile on Amazon, and I want to go over to, I forget what the big competitor is in China for Amazon, but the other big, cute Alibaba, right? I want to go to Alibaba. I could do that today. I could have accounts in both. That's really no big deal, assuming I want to do that. But if I want to wholesale get out of Amazon, try to have Amazon forget about you as a customer. Until now, that hasn't been possible. Now I can be, right? Reference right to be forgotten. And I can take all that data that's rich and meaningful, and I can take it to their competitor and say, I prefer to do business with you. You offer better terms, or I like you better, or whatever. And they have nothing to say about it. As long as I follow the rules and I do what I'm supposed to do, that is a legal obligation they have and a legal right that I can exercise as a customer. Privacy by design. I have the ability to be able to go in as the manager of data and kind of the company entity, if you will. And I have the ability to figure out, and I should not only have the ability, I do, but I have the right, the obligation to figure out how to, as it says in the second bullet point, design in data processing by default with regards to privacy. You know, one of the mantras of IT security that I've spent 30 plus years beating into my customers and students' heads, I've spoken about all over the world, I've written about in the many books and articles that I've published, is the idea of security by design. We now talk about privacy by design. The idea that you build security in from the beginning as you build a system, it seems to be more costly, it seems to be more complicated, when you look at it from the outside. But anybody that's done system or software development lifecycle work, right, and has built a system will tell you that it is infinitely better, it is infinitely easier, and it is infinitely cheaper to do security by design and build security in from the beginning than it is to bolt it on and try to figure out how to reverse engineer it in after the fact. You never get it right. It's never good enough. There's not enough money in the world, and you're going to break everything that does work well in the process, right? So when we try to build privacy by design, we're talking about wholesale re-architecting of the very nature of how we interpret information, how we perceive it, how we manage it, and ultimately, who's responsible for it. And this is a very paradigm-shifting thought process. Oh, by the way, the other real important one at the bottom there, I almost forgot. We have this new concept building on something called a BIA, a business impact analysis, which if you've done risk impact work, if you've done any kind of BCDR, business continuity disaster recovery work, and you've done the architecture and thought process of inventory of services and assignment of probability with regards to interruption and the valuation of that, you're familiar with the BIA because that's really what it does. This is a DPIA, data protection impact assessment or analysis, depending on whose interpretation you read. It's essentially the same concept as a BIA, but done around data protection as opposed to systems. And the BIA is focused on systems. This is focused on data protection. Yet another thing for consultancies and service vendors to be able to sell you as a managed service, right? Yay. All right. Data protection officers, right? I talked about DPOs and why they are so important. Staff awareness and training is one of the key pillars of what we see enshrined in the GDPR, because in order to have a DPO that is effective, a specified, carved out, uniquely defined role in the organization that is inhabited by knowledgeable individuals, one or more depending on the size of the organization, that is going to, as you see there, professionally qualified. That remains an open item because there is no formal certification to be a DPO right now, but obviously we reference certain frameworks that may or may not be helpful there. But appointed in public authorities or organizations, so both in the public and private sector, that are going to engage in systematic monitoring and also oversight, as well as processing of personal data. This is the governance function in the GRC equation with regards to GDPR. Governance, risk, and compliance, GRC, right? The governance oversight portion is the data protection officer. We're translating that oversight there. So when we think about that, we really think about how we're going to ensure that we're doing the right things and hold someone accountable if we do not, right? Very important. All right, so let's talk about some questions. I promise you some assessment questions, right? By category. I don't want you to answer these questions, but I want you to look at them and think about them, because there are no right answers, by the way, right? So the first category is protecting personal data, one of the key areas we focus on in GDPR. So when I meet with customers, and I do GDPR assessment work over the last couple of years, and even before then, as I did assessment work under 9546 in the directive, I spend time with customers talking about things like this, right? So does your organization have sufficient technical measures and processes in place to secure personal and sensitive data? That's a mouthful. What do I mean by that? What kind of controls do you have around information? Who has access to it? Under what circumstances? In what formats? Where is it stored? Is it portable? Can you account for every copy of your financial data today, right now, in your company if I ask you to? Do you know who has access to it? Is it in the cloud? Is it on-prem? I could stop at any point in time, right? You get the idea, right? There is a wealth of underlying complexity that this question rolls up. And every one of these are potential landmines that are as complex. Are your data collection, or is your data collection, data processing, and supporting technology, the platforms, in other words, we use, are they built to include privacy and protection principles? And more importantly, more accurately today, what that really should be is what frameworks and what standards are they certified against? Are they ISO 20000 certified? Are they ISO 27000 et al? 01, 02, 18, 16, 17 around cloud, et cetera? Are they ISO certified and aligned? Are they risk management framework aligned? Are they NIST cybersecurity framework aligned? Notice I didn't say certified, because there's no certification for some of these, which can be aligned with them. Very important distinction. How many of you know what ISO 27001 and 27002 are as international standards? May be really important for you to figure that out with regards to this, for instance. They are the implementation controls and the framework guidance taken together. They're kind of like a brother and sister pair, right? that offer us the opportunity to understand how to build what's called the ISMS, the Information Security Management System, or more commonly referred to as the enterprise security architecture in a company. Very clearly, critically aligned with what we're talking about here, and yet most individuals, most IT professionals, most security practitioners I talk to don't know that they've been around. And they've been around for well over a decade, and yet most people don't know what they are. How much of your personal data and sensitive data is currently encrypted both at rest and in transit? We talked about three aspects of the data lifecycle commonly. Data at rest is sometimes called data in storage. We put it over there, and we want to make sure it's protected when it's over there and nobody's paying attention to it, all right? Data in transit, or what we call data on the wire. It's moving between my computer and some other system somewhere, typically the cloud these days. And data in use, an application that I have open, maybe this PowerPoint application I'm using to present data, maybe the web browser that I'm using, is consuming data, interacting, sending it back and forth. These are the three states and sections of the data lifecycle that we often speak about with regards to encryption. Is your data encrypted when it's in storage? What about when it's in transit on the wire? Today, more often than not, you could assume it's in transit and it's most likely encrypted because natively, most of the transmission mechanisms and pathways we use are encrypted. But is it encrypted in storage? Ooh, that's a whole different conversation. Very hard to know for sure, right? I'll give you one real world example about this without overly beating up the cloud providers in question too much. I'm not going to name the names, but I'm going to talk about two of the three biggest cloud providers in the world today. You can probably figure out who they are, right? One of them natively encrypts all data in storage automatically, meaning anything you put in their cloud anywhere in the world is automatically encrypted. You don't have to do a thing. Part of your usage fee and your ability to use their platform. One of the other cloud providers does not natively do that, has not natively done that since the beginning of their platform, as a matter of fact, which is why you hear time and again about their name associated with data exposure in the cloud, because their storage system, a bucket-like storage system, if you will, without giving away their name, is not natively encrypted. You have the ability to encrypt. This is the horrible and actually ugly truth about this. You actually can encrypt data on that platform, but you as the owner have to go in and make a choice to enable it. You can encrypt it just as strongly as the other cloud providers provide you the ability to do. AES 256-bit encryption, the gold standard today. But you have to enable that as opposed to having it natively turned on. This is not only hugely problematic on many, many levels, but this flies just in the face of everything we're talking about here, right? Imagine the fines that company may be looking at. 4% of gross revenue, up to 20 million euros a year. They may write a check and say, you know what, 20 million, cost of doing business, right? We buy more than that in paper clips every year, who cares? And that's fine. If you're that big, maybe you can afford to do that. But the reality is, it's a lot of money. Imagine if they took that money and put it in a risk mitigation and figured out a better way to encrypt natively. How much better everybody would be, right? Let's go back to the presentation. We could have about 2 minutes, want to wrap up and then leave time for your questions. I'm going to skip through some of the other protecting personal data questions. I'll encourage you to take a look at them. But what I want to focus on is compliance with risk with regards to just a minute here. Again, how strong, question number one, right? How strong is your data governance program? Do you even have a data governance program, right? Would be a better question, but let's assume you do, including policies enforcement and the evil IT word that everybody cringes when they hear. It's like Voldemort's name if you're a Harry Potter person, or Beetlejuice if you prefer that, right? 3 times. Documentation. How good is documentation? I could retire. I have a passion for what I do. I could retire if I chose to go into the consulting business writing documentation for companies, right? Because that's how big the need is out there. And that's how horrible the unspoken truth is about the lack of documentation. How often do you obtain consent before beginning to use personal data? These days, more so probably than ever before, but even then, that's going to be a huge hill to climb. Right? You can see some of the other questions here. Again, I'll encourage you to go through them in the presentation, through the deck. I put a lot more in than I knew we would get to, but I wanted you to have a takeaway that would allow you to have a framework that you could begin to assess against. But I do want to call out one other one here. If someone contacted you and asked you, question number 5, middle of this screen, asked you to correct their personal data, remember we have an obligation to do that, right? Hey, this is wrong, you got to fix it. I'm not Adam Gordon, I'm Adam Smith. You got to get that right, and get that right in a timely fashion. How quickly could you comply? Remember, 24 to 72 hours is the time frame. Most companies can't even tell you you're a customer in 24 hours, let alone that they could fix your customer record in 24 hours, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, and finally, 8 ways to take action. summary points that you can latch onto and really understand how to take away. The first one, assign a dedicated individual or team to focus on GDPR issues. A little bit late for you to do that, right? If you haven't already started that, but I say, do this even if it's going to cost you money. There's no bad time to prepare for risk. Even if you miss the window to get it done in a timely fashion, start today. You're going to start mitigating from that point forward. Your risk profile gets less and less over time. You're less likely to have a problem. Think about the logic of that, right? It's never a bad time to prepare, in other words. Inventory all systems that house data and document the PII. We call that PI, personally identifiable information. Not the kind you eat, right? But still, really important. That is collected in and or by each system. Think about something as basic, and we often overlook this, as your ERP system that provisions not just your employees, but what about the card key access system, right? That provisions their ability to use whatever swipe cards you have, or the inventory list for tokens that you give out, cross-reference with individuals, or any kind of that information. All of that can be problematic. Understand the transfer of data between you and a third party. This is all about supply chain risk and management of supply chain risk, managing down in the organization. ISO has a standard for this. If you're not familiar with it, you should take a look. This is one of the biggest issues in IT and governance today, the supply chain risk and third-party risk, especially with the advent of cloud and virtualization technology. Also, consent and determining if automated data could be ported, right? Can we do that, and if so, under what conditions? All very important elements. And the last one, probably the most important on the whole list, what is your data breach plan, right? And if you don't already have one, boy, have you got some conversations to start thinking about. And by the way, you actually do have one. You may not realize it. If you have a BCDR plan, you have the elements of a data breach plan. You just may have to reshape them to address these specific concerns. But I do a lot of work with customers that are stuck in that area. Oh, we don't know what that is. But we have this great BCDR thing we've been doing for 30 years. Well, let's take that and let's reinvent that, because that's how we square that box. All right, I know we want to entertain some questions. I guess Don is going to come up. I'm going to grab my hairband that fell off while I was talking, but Don's going to come up and I guess MC for us.
Yes, we're going to do a quick Q&A, and just so that everybody who is watching remotely can benefit, I've got a microphone I'm going to bring by to you. So if you can raise your hand and wait for me to get the mic over to you to ask your question.
Our person in the back was very interested in asking a question first, so let's give her the option to go first. No pressure, by the way, but because you're going first, it has to be an awesome question. Okay.
Uh-oh. So thank you for this presentation. This has been so informative. And as a non-IT person, I learned so much. And it was in layman's terms. So I have key takeaways. But my question is around the 72-hour window that the company has to notify the 500 million subscribers that were
breach notification.
Yeah. From a legal perspective, when does that 72 hours start? Is it when the person on the bottom of the totem pole gets that notification, wait, something's wrong? Or is it when the leadership is notified that a breach has happened? And how do the articles spell that out? Because I think unless that's clear, there's a lot of room where 72 hours can become, 154
Absolutely. And so
hours.
it's a great question, first of all. And it speaks to one of the key concerns, right, that creating this kind of framework can potentially bring up, which is there are a million scenarios that potentially could play out around something like this. We discover a breach, and the point of discovery from an incident management perspective is a service desk or help desk professional who perhaps opens a ticket that leads to the uncovering, right, of a breach. Are they now starting the clock ticking? Essentially because they've, quote unquote, have knowledge of it. As you suggested, as we move it up, the incident management and potentially the response chain, which hopefully is well defined in the organization, does that start the clock ticking? Do we have to put it squarely in front of the C-level or senior management before we start the clock ticking? There are scenarios that play out around a variety of things. The easiest answer, right, that I will give you, not the one you're looking for, but the easiest answer, because there's not a definitive, it's always this way no matter what answer. But the easiest answer is that the spirit of GDPR is about erring on the side of caution, meaning error on the side of let's ensure we protect and enshrine the rights of the individual, and let's not err on the side of protecting the corporate entity who may or may not be culpable. And what I mean by that is that clearly if there's a breach, somebody's responsible, without getting into the specifics of who it may be. Whether it was accidental, whether it was purposeful, whether it was because of a bad configuration, or because somebody did everything right and somebody better came along and just jumped into an opportunity and took advantage of it. What has to happen is that we have to have a purposeful, well thought out, and well documented response plan that has to be executed by clearly identified individuals in the organization in order to be compliant. The data protection officer, the DPO role that I spoke about, really becomes critical here, because without enshrining the DPO as a formally acknowledged, defined, and populated role, because one of the conversations I've been having with customers recently is, well, okay, we don't even have a DPO on our org chart, let alone know who that's going to be. So if we put it on the org chart with a big question mark, is that okay? Are we going to be all right on May 25th? Right? Will that be good? Well, that's a start, but who do I go to when I have a problem? And do I go to the question mark? I wasn't present for yearbook photos that day. There's that stick figure, right? Yeah, that doesn't work. You got to have it there, but you got to put John Smith or Sally Jones in that role. You got to empower them, and you've got to enable them to act as the point person or point organizational management entity for risk. And if you do that, their job is to pay attention to those warning signs and aggregate that information and understand that a compliance issue has occurred, and they are the lead for then reporting out and interacting with the organizations, plural, outside the business, because now we're talking about creating not multiple streams of disconnected communication, but a conduit that is well-focused, well-structured, and is clearly defined with regards to communication. And that's the goal of how we respond.
All right, we've got our next question over here.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you something, but first I wanted to say that you're a great teacher. You said there were 98 items that had to be taken care of as part of this, and if you get a 98 on this test, then you get a CompTIA A+.
Well, thank you. I'll go you one better, because I would love to have one, but I actually do. I have one of the original ones. I've been A+ certified since the beta, for the very first A+ certification.
Fantastic. Congratulations.
Thanks.
I have a question regarding enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Who enforces this regulation, and how will it be enforced? Who are they going after first, do you think?
So without getting on the blacklist for most of the vendors that I purport to work with and hopefully represent, let's leave names out of this, right? Let's keep this generic. So I think it's a great question, but let me adjust the trajectory just a little bit, and then let me offer you a perspective. In terms of who enforces this, it's a relatively straightforward conversation. There is a regulatory framework and a infrastructure put behind it that is now in place or is finalized and in place within the EU overall. So the EU government apparatus that sits above any member nation is really going to be taking this on and driving it, in the sense that there's a regulatory arm that now is enshrined in dealing with these aspects. Part of it may wind up in the court system, where the EU can adjudicate information and concerns with regards to penalties and things like that. So there is a process for you to go and appeal with a ICO, the arm that is at the country level set up to act as the point entity, the organizational entity, with regards to information management and privacy rights by country. So there's a regular, I didn't put the flow chart for the structure in, just because I thought it was a little involved, but I have one that really represents this and points it out. But there is an ICO entity that sits by country that is in charge of dealing with it on a per country basis. And so as a result, we have that. That's fairly straightforward. I think the broader issue, right, you mentioned, which is, are they going to go after, they being amorphous, are they going to go after one or more entities, and if so, who? I hear this a lot from companies and from a lot of my customers. I don't think that there's a hit list. I'm not suggesting you're suggesting there is, just to be clear. I don't think there's a hit list. I don't think the Microsofts, the Googles, the Amazons, the VMwares of the world are on that list as poster children, right, for what should be done to beat them up with a big stick and prove a point. I don't think that's the case. I hope that's not the case. And I traditionally and honestly don't believe it is. But I do think we're on a slippery slope. And I think those companies have to pay attention, and here's why. Because we've seen evidence from a regulatory and a legislative perspective in the courts, both here in the US and globally in many other areas, in the last 15 years, challenging aspects of what we knew would become the GDPR. The right to be forgotten, which was a fight that was fought and lost by several of the companies I mentioned, right? Google chief among them. The issues about 15 years ago, approximately, that Microsoft had with regards to being a monopolistic competitor and decoupling some of their software from other aspects of their software, the Internet Explorer web browser issue, right, and things like that. I think companies are always pushing the boundaries of what they can do to be competitive. I think if they think that this is an area that they can compete in, I think we may have a problem. Because if they try to push each other over the brink, I think that's an issue. I think if they view this as an opportunity to get better on behalf of everybody and use that as a competitive advantage, I think everybody wins. And I think therefore they won't be targeted. But it remains to be seen. It's hard to say. Like I said, that $20 million price tag, it's not a lot of money for these big companies. And I'm not suggesting that means they won't act ethically. I'm just pointing out that there's a ramp to be compliant. A lot of them have been on that ramp for a long time, but a lot of them, because of mergers and acquisitions, Dell's a great example of this. They bought up the world in the last couple of years, right? They own VMware, they own EMC, which owned VMware, and they own a huge swath of infrastructure. They're a great company. They got a lot of great technology, but they may or may not be on track to be compliant because of acquisitions. In other words, Dell itself may have been on track to be compliant. What about all the other companies they gobbled up in the last 2 or 3 years? What were they doing? Go back to that idea of supply chain risk. I don't know, and it may be hard to tell. And so there may be a lot of companies that get their checkbook out for a couple of years or push to get waivers because they're trying to comply. And it's a gray area. We're not sure what's going to happen with that. Good faith, in other words, may prove to win the day. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know which one was.
We'll go right here real quick, just because I'm closer.
Oh, okay.
All right, quick.
You're going to get to ask your question next. I know, because I know you've been patiently waiting. Yeah.
Sorry. A quick question. Yeah. With the concept of users' right to be forgotten, that creates a lot of questions for people that have to maintain data that is not easy to forget, payment processing data and such. Some of the language in the regulation is a little squishy when it comes to terms of unless you have a reasonable business reason not to forget the user,
which is squishy and amorphous.
Yes. How do you interpret that?
So I think the bigger question, right, is not so much how would I interpret. I know that's not what you're asking. You're just generically asking how would you interpret it as a company. I think the bigger question, and the thing I work with a lot of my customers on, is let's come up again, going back to this idea of best effort, right? Good faith. Let's try to figure out how to be on the right side of it. Let's come up with the documentation and the process, and let's really define what we're able to do. And this is the key that many companies often miss. Realistically, what can we stand on and deliver on today? Where are we going to go in 6 months, and where are we going to be in a year, right? And you often hear about a 30, 60, 90 or a 1-3-5 plan if you're in sales, things like that, right? So let's treat risk management the same way we treat financial planning, is my point. Let's come up with reasonable, attainable timeline-based goals. Let's clearly define and state them, and let's put them out there to ensure that we're holding ourselves accountable, and let's move towards a standard that is realistically achievable, not one that's amorphous and ill-defined. I don't think that the goal of the people that wrote the GDPR was to say it's got to be this way or else, which is why you have the squishy language, to my point. I do think the goal was to force companies to think about what they're going to do in order to get better at doing, which is honestly, and by everyone's definition, almost nothing, and push them into areas where we can measure, we can hold accountable, and we can create opportunities to improve, right, based on suggestions. And what you're going to see over time in the next few years is you're going to see guidelines coming out based on court cases that have been assessed, fines that have been levied. Hey, everybody that got fined did this thing. Let's make sure you don't do this anymore. And you're going to start seeing those kinds of guidance documents coming online. And I think it'll become a lot clearer. I also don't think you're going to see heavy fines laid right in the beginning, as I was suggesting. So I think it's going to be impossible to say on the stroke of the clock on May 25th, everybody who's not compliant, get out your checkbook, right? You had 2 years, you should have figured it out. We had 2 years of unfortunately, a lot of discussion without a lot of substantive guidance. And as a result, it's very hard to say what compliance will be. And I think until that target stops moving and it becomes more clearly understood, it's going to be very hard for them to levy fines. And I think we're going to see a ramp. And I think that ramp's going to be probably a 3 to 5 year window before we really see significant fines being levied. So it takes about that long to figure out how to get on the right side of this. Yeah.
Just for that, I'm going to ask 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first is, this sounds like it has the ability to actually be more impactful than Y2K. And given that, why hasn't there been more media coverage of this? Why are we finding out about this at the 11th hour? And the other question is anybody considering doing any real serious pushback in terms of, giant ordering companies saying, if you're from the EU, we're not going to comply with the GDPR, and if you want to use our system, then, you waive all rights?
So let me take the second question first, right? Which is, has any company, right, thumbed their nose at the EU and essentially said GDPR, right? I'm not doing that. Goodbye, good luck, right? I'll see you if you can force me to open my checkbook. Interesting that you bring that up, and I'll tell you why. So I was reading an article earlier today, aside from the one on Comcast having their little oopsie with their data breach, which was also very telling about this. So Amazon, which you just mentioned as one potential customer or company rather in this area, has started to admit publicly that they actually profile customers, and we all have known this for a long time, for a lot of things. One that's very interesting. They profile customers based on the amount of returns they make, based on articles that are ordered. And if you return whatever this threshold is, they did not define it, don't know what it is. If you return things too often, they actually are restricting your ability to use their platform and essentially saying, hey, you know what? We don't want you as a customer, or we only want you, but under these restricted terms, right? Maybe you can only have a 7-day return period instead of maybe 30 days or whatever it is now, I don't know. But they've taken steps to do that. This has nothing to do with GDPR, by the way, just using it as an example of what you asked about. So it's interesting, right, that these companies that are literally the engines of the global economy have taken strides in certain areas to continue, because this is not new, to continue to say, you know what, we're going to try to shape and restrict your behavior. That's what the online world is all about. I think it's unfortunate that companies feel that that's something that works, right? I think the draconian, heavy-handed tactics we've seen time and again, while they may work in the short term, generate a lot of concern and ultimately, I think, lead to outcomes like the GDPR, because I think legislative and regulatory bodies pay attention to this, whether we really do think they do or not, because they move a lot slower, right, than many of us would like. But I think you could trace the evidence of historical evolution of GDPR to several key events, and one of them was some of these legal battles I talked about earlier with regards to companies in the technology sector that made a stand along the lines of what you're saying and said, you know what? We don't have to pay attention to you. We don't have to treat you as an individual and a customer like you actually matter and you have rights. We can do what we want. And we've seen now the evidence of the fact that you could do it, but you got to get your checkbook out, right? So I don't think you can constrain behavior to the point that you stop it. I think it's foolish and folly to try. I think you can encourage and you can prod and you can chide, and I think you can attach financial penalties to it, which is what the GDPR does. I think the long-winded answer, let me bring down to a short answer for this one is, I think if companies are willing to pay the fines, then they'll continue as before, because that's what will happen over time. Whether or not those fines can be enforced is really the interesting part of the answer to your question, because if a company is willing to walk away from that line of business in that region and say, hey, you know what? You're an EU citizen, do it on our terms or don't do it at all. What's going to happen is the EU is going to say, oh, that's nice. Guess what? You have no ability to do business here. You may do it electronically if we don't catch you, but try putting boots on the ground. Open an office, create a distribution center, land your ships in our ports and distribute your goods and find out what happens. Because at that point, they have the stick to be able to enforce those fines. And they'll levy taxes and they'll essentially encumber goods, and that'll be the end of the conversation. You know, we've seen the effect, in other words, of sanctions globally, right? They hurt, and over time, they will drive businesses to change. So I think it's interesting, and again, it's going to be an interesting crucible and dynamic over time. I think hopefully cooler heads will prevail, and I think companies will find the value in compliance, but I think customers have to step up and not overextend the obligatory rights that they now can hold companies aligned to. And I think you can't go beat a company up just because you want to test your ability to be forgotten and make a big deal out of the fact that they didn't comply within 72 hours, right? So I think cooler heads have to prevail on both sides of the divide. The first question again, right, because that was the second one, right? First one, and forgive me, I'm normally really good at keeping track of these, but I have to admit I forgot your first question. So tell me what it was again. Yeah. Y2K, right, okay, that's, yeah. So Y2K. So interesting, right? Y2K was this huge, huge nothing, right, at the end of the day. Look, it was impactful, don't get me wrong, right? But ultimately, it proved to be a lot of hype and not a lot of substance after we got through it all. Thankfully, could have obviously gone the other way. Will this essentially fall into the same boat? And why haven't we heard more about it? To be fair, right? To be fair, full disclosure, areas and segments of many, many different industries have been talking about GDPR for well beyond the 2-year limit just between April of 2016 and now. This has been an ongoing debate for probably close to 10 years in some sectors of the world. I think the bigger issue and the bigger question that we have to frame is, why is the average decision maker in the average business not finding out about it until the 12th hour, right? because that's really the bigger issue. It's not the huge mega corporations that have compliance teams that are going to be able to figure this out. It's the smaller businesses that are on the hook and may not even realize they are. And why aren't they more knowledgeable? Why haven't they been educated? I think there's a lot of reasons you could point to. I think ultimately we are drowning in a sea of misunderstanding about things that are relevant to technology and policy. And this is just one example. It's hard to separate out, in other words, the really important facts from all the hype about data breaches and all the other stuff that's going on and focus on things that actually matter. And I think that's unfortunate.
All right, Adam, I think we have time for one more question. Do we have a question over here? Nope. Oh, okay. All right. I think we're, all right.
more?
Last question right over here.
Thank you for giving the talk. I was wondering, you talk about companies, and you never talk about the size of the company. Or if someone has a store online, they sell honey and they ship it, ship it places, but they'll have 2 people, mom and pop. Are they required to have a DPO to meet these guidelines? How does one go about, how does small organizations handle it?
Sure, I won't go into the document right now because we're kind of broadcasting out. Oh, actually, no, you guys can see it, nobody else can. So let me just, while we're talking, let me just bring something up that'll help us to have this part of the conversation. But, so yes, there definitely are some thresholds we have to address and be concerned about. There's my desktop. I think that, I'm just trying to get to, actually, I probably won't be able to find it right now. So let me just leave this up and we'll just, we'll end with that. So yes, there are thresholds and there are certain guidelines in the GDPR overall. Mom and pops of a certain size, quote unquote, right, with an online presence or without, et cetera, are not going to be tarred by this brush in the sense that they have to necessarily be compliant. But I think the broader issue, right, is not so much, hey, I'm a 5-person versus a 50-person company, and as a result, I may or may not have to comply. Let me turn this around to a slightly different perspective for you. I mentioned this a couple of times in my presentation. Third-party risk and supply chain risk, I think, is the big black hole that nobody's really thought about or is addressing. It is addressed very formally and very properly in GDPR, but I think a lot of companies and entities miss this. We may not be compliant or even have to be based on size, but what about entities that we do business with? What if they have to be compliant and they're not? Does that mean ultimately that I may have down-level exposure as a third party associated in their supply chain that led to them being non-compliant? Will they turn around and try to sue me, right? Or can I turn around and sue them? And those are issues that may or may not ever come home to roost and are not clearly understood today. A lot of this is evolving as we go. I mentioned the impact of technology on the framing of this context and conversation. I didn't get a chance to bring up the point I wanted to make. But the point I was going to make is that while we talk about things like data frameworks and portability and data standards like CSV as an extensible format to export data, what we don't really see and what we haven't talked about is the impact of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data and data analytics, and what that kind of capacity, power, and information manipulation may mean in the face of regulation like this. Because we know, and we've seen historically over the last 15 to 20 years, certainly in the last 7 years and into the present day, with regards to the advent and just the global mushrooming of cloud technology. And you think about the impact that cloud has taken on. It's transformed the world. Steve Jobs, famously, right, talked about the fact that Apple was transformative. And people often say that, he was a transformative figure, right or wrong, whether you like what he did or not. And his company has been transformative, just like many other companies we could point to in many areas. I think all of that's great. I think the big tsunami, the tidal wave that's coming in this regard, is going to be whether or not the ability to manage data without borders is going to be something we could figure out how to do in the face of this regulation. Because data knows no boundary. It knows no border. It doesn't recognize that you're in or out of the EU. It doesn't care where you are. It just cares about the endpoint in your hand, because that's where the new border and the new security battles that we fight every day are being waged, right? And all of your smartphones in your pockets, on my computer right here, and all around us in the bits that move between them all the time. Anybody a Willy Wonka fan, the original Willy Wonka? You guys like that movie? You remember where they go into the TV studio, right? Mike TV, and Willy Wonka shoots him across the room, and you see all the little bits flying across, right? And he transforms and winds up this big in the TV. That's the paradigm that we're talking about. You're shooting information back and forth with no boundaries. And this is the bigger issue that GDPR, I think, is framed, but doesn't really have an answer for. And I think that's why we're going to continue to see evolution in this area. Because it's not about how big you are and whether you comply or not. It's about the information you touch and whether that requires compliance, regardless of size. And that's the proper way to think about it. Should I? No? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Adam, it was a great presentation. We thank you, and I hope people came away with some insight based on your
Hopefully.
knowledge, and we'll
Hopefully.
be able to act on it.
I hope so.
I want to thank ITProTV and Don for making the resources available to us. Our chapter, we've really enjoyed the opportunity to join a leading tech company here in Gainesville, Florida, and around the world. So thank you very much, Don, for everything that you've done. We appreciate that. Wanted to let people know once again that this is going to be streamed, not streamed, but it's going to be available as a recording. So if you go to AITP-NCFL.org, you'll be able to find our presentation today for review. And we plan another meeting on June 26th, Tuesday. The topic is not fully fleshed out yet, but as soon as we have that information, we'll provide it to you. And one other thing, if you're interested in AITP, CompTIA, and want to get involved or learn more, please contact us. There are lots of ways to reach us. So thank you once again for your attention and for being with us today. Thank you.